Okay then, welcome to this tutorial. This tutorial will give you the fundamental basics of knowledge and skills towards animation, and you're going to be essentially creating a bouncing ball. So I found an example online. There you go, a simple bounce there. That we are going to recreate. Now there are different ways of animation. There's a frame by frame level of animation that we'll be going into at some point in time, but I'm going to give you a more simple process that both After Effects and Premiere Pro, the editing software that you're going to be using, use. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, I want you to open up Adobe After Effects. You'll find it on your Mac, and once you get to this stage, I would like you to click New Project. Okay, and then New Composition. Once you're in this area, you'll find that everything's perfectly fine. I want you to just take note of the frame rate here. The frame rate is at 29.97 frames per second, but that's essentially 30 frames per second, and you can actually change this if you would like. Okay, you can go all the way down to 12 frames per second for limited animation. Generally, television is 25 frames per second. The human eye, it's said, generally sees movement and things like that at 24 frames per second. So that is the limit to what is natural motion. Okay, anything above that is extra. Okay, we're going to keep it at 29.97 frames per second. Okay, and you can always change that if you want. Okay, so what you have here is the composition area. You've also got the timeline here. Now, if you've used editing software, you'll notice the timeline works in a similar sort of way. Okay, we didn't just get cracking, get right into it, get started. Okay, so we're going to create a ellipse. You'll find shapes up here in a limited set of tools. Okay, let's just change the color of this. All right then, so drag out your circle just to start with. Just create a simple circle. Okay, now when you create a circle, you will notice that there is an anchor point here, a little crosshair. Okay, that essentially is the middle of whatever shape that you're using. Okay, in the transform options, you can see anchor point specifically set there. Okay, we're not necessarily going to be using anchor point for this tutorial, but I just want you to differentiate between the position and anchor point options here. Okay, so the position of the ball, if I move it around, that essentially will change based on the transformation. Okay, the anchor point is actually not center at this point in time. There are two anchor points here, but we're just using the simple transformation tools here. So just make sure that the anchor point, once you have it selected, is all set in the middle. Okay, but specifically for this tutorial, we're going to be using position and scale. Okay, and obviously the transformation options and everything like that can be found with this little drop down arrow. Okay, you can see drop down arrows throughout the program. Now, let's get started. So essentially, animation in this sense, it's called tweening. The technique of animation is related to specifically keyframes. Okay, so we're going to create a keyframe. Now, this marker essentially shows us where on the timeline we are. You can see the time is actually changing there. So I'm just going to leave it here for now. I'm going to click this stopwatch button. Okay, let's move the marker out of the way. And where the marker was, we've left a keyframe. Okay, now essentially your first keyframe is placed by clicking that stopwatch. Now that you've got your first keyframe, don't click that stopwatch again. If you do, it will make any keyframe that you have created disappear. Okay, so you'll lose work if you essentially do that. Okay, so we've got our first keyframe. Now, tweening is essentially the movement between two keyframes, hence the term tweening. It relates to between. Okay, so essentially let's start by moving this object before you can make a new keyframe in this way, you need to make sure that you've moved the marker along the timeline, just so that there's opportunity to add another keyframe. Now that I've moved this down, you'll notice that a line appears, all of this extra stuff happens, yeah? And that is essentially indicating movement between the two keyframes, okay? So you can see here the position has a certain numerical value related to the coordinates on the screen, on the composition. If we move that back, you'll notice that changes, and that's that animation happening, that's that movement between, okay? So essentially have a play around with this before you move on, just so that you can get your head around that aspect. You know, you can just throw this anywhere if you wanted to. Just make sure that you move the timeline along and, you know, then move the ball. Or you could, if you wanted to be a lot more accurate, you can actually use the specific coordinates of your, you know, vector path, okay? All right. So, now that we have the object and we've made it move down, let's treat the bottom of the screen as the floor and change the scale. So I click the stopwatch again, I'm going to move this keyframe along, and then I'm going to change the scale. Now I'm changing the scale specifically for the width and height, but separately I'm going to be doing this, and you can see this by these two. That I believe is height and that is width, okay? If I was to move this at this point in time, yeah, it's just going to animate the size of the ball as a whole, okay? Because both of those are linked together. What we need to do is essentially tick off constrained properties. I'm just going to go back before I actually made any changes. So this little chain here is constraining the properties. So we're going to click that off, and you'll then see that you can manipulate the height and the width separately, okay? I'd just like you to do that now, so that as your ball reaches the bottom of the screen, it does a little squish, like it would do generally anyway, okay? Once you've got that, you're about halfway through the main elements of this sequence that you want to produce, okay? I'm just going to show you a little trick. Now that you've got these keyframes, you can duplicate these keyframes without having to move this or change the numbers here along the timeline. So I'll show you how that's the case. So I'll select this keyframe, press Command C or Edit Copy, yep, and then move my marker along to the point where I want to leave it again. So Command V or Paste, okay? Now that you've done that, it will move back up, okay, because the movement is from now this position to that position as opposed to that position to this position. Up to down, down to up, okay? So the only other thing for us to do at this point in time is to sort out the scale as well, because we've left the scale as it is. So it shouldn't be like this, it should have retained its shape. So again, let's do that. Command C, Command V. Yep. And we'll play that back, squish, and it goes back up. Now that we're at this stage, you've practically done it at this point in time, okay? So I'd like you to just let your tutor know that you're at this stage and you've been able to make the bouncing ball. They're going to give you some specific feedback to help you, okay? There is an advanced video in this tutorial series that I'd like you to then go on to, okay? Thank you very much.